After years of studying neuroscientists and brain researchers, I discovered something that completely changed the way I understand the human mind. Your brain is not designed to make you happy. It is designed to help you survive. And that difference explains an enormous amount about how you think, how you learn, how you make decisions, and why you so consistently do things that you know are not in your best interest. It explains why you remember the one criticism in a room full of compliments, why you feel anxious about situations that are not actually dangerous, why pleasure fades so quickly while discomfort lingers, why your mind drifts to worst-case scenarios when left unoccupied, and why simply knowing something is bad for you is almost never enough to stop you from doing it. Once you understand what your brain is actually trying to do, everything that seemed irrational about human behavior starts to make complete sense. And more importantly, you get real tools for working with your brain rather than against it. I want to take you through exactly what I found across years of conversations with researchers and years of going deep into the neuroscience literature, not to give you a list of productivity hacks, not to give you a positivity framework, but to give you an accurate map of what is actually happening inside your skull. Because an accurate map is the most useful thing I can offer. The wrong map, the one that tells you your brain is a rational organ that will cooperate with your conscious goals if you just try harder, leads to strategies that consistently fail and to self-blame when they do. The right map leads to strategies that actually work. Let me start with the most fundamental thing I learned, which is about the architecture of the brain and why it matters for everything practical that follows. The human brain did not arrive fully formed as the complex organ it is today. It evolved in layers over hundreds of millions of years, and each layer was added on top of the previous one without replacing it. The oldest parts, the brainstem and related structures, are responsible for the most basic survival functions: breathing, heart rate, body temperature regulation, the fight or flight response. These systems operate completely outside your conscious awareness, and they have near absolute priority over almost everything else the brain does. When they detect threat, everything else reorganizes around that threat detection. Above that is the limbic system, which processes emotion, social bonding, memory, and motivation. This is the system that generates fear, desire, grief, love, disgust, and the social drives that are fundamental to human behavior. And sitting on top of all of that is the neocortex, and particularly the prefrontal cortex, which is the newest and most distinctly human part of the brain. This is where conscious deliberation happens, where you plan, reason, reflect, and make what you think of as your decisions. Here is the critical thing about this architecture that almost nobody explains clearly enough. These layers do not function as equals. The older systems are faster, stronger, and more deeply wired than the prefrontal cortex. When there is conflict between what the emotional and survival systems want and what the prefrontal cortex has decided is best, the emotional and survival systems win the vast majority of the time. The prefrontal cortex is extraordinary. It is what allows you to write poetry and build cities and plan for a future you will never see. But it is not the boss. It is more like an advisor to systems that evolved long before it existed and that do not always take its advice. The practical consequence of this architecture is enormous. Every strategy for self-improvement, every behavior change program, every attempt to think your way to different choices runs into this same biological wall. You cannot simply decide to feel differently. You cannot simply reason your way out of a fear response. You cannot simply tell yourself that you should be more motivated and generate genuine motivation, because the systems that produce those states are not the system that is listening to your reasoning. They are older, faster, and less interested in what you consciously want than in what they evolved to protect you from. Understanding this does not mean you are powerless. It means you need a completely different strategy than the one most people use. Let me go into the specific survival mechanisms that shape daily experience in ways most people do not recognize as survival mechanisms. The first and most important is the negativity bias. The human brain is wired to weight negative information significantly more heavily than positive information of equivalent magnitude. This is not a personality quirk or a sign of clinical depression. It is a universal feature of how the brain allocates attention and memory. Research by Roy Baumeister and colleagues, who published a comprehensive review titled "Bad is Stronger Than Good," found consistent asymmetry between the psychological impact of negative and positive experiences across a wide range of domains, including social interactions, financial decisions, learning, and emotional well-being. Negative events produce larger and longer-lasting psychological responses than positive events of comparable size. The evolutionary logic is straightforward and compelling. An organism that treats potential threats as more salient than potential rewards is more likely to survive in an environment where threats can kill and missed rewards are merely unfortunate. Missing a meal is bad. Being eaten is terminal. The asymmetry in attention and memory is the brain's response to that asymmetry in consequence. The problem is that this calibration made perfect sense in the environment where it evolved and creates significant dysfunction in modern environments where most of the apparent threats are not actually lethal. Your brain responds to a critical email from your boss with a threat response that is functionally similar to the one it produces when a predator is nearby. The subjective experience differs in intensity, but the underlying neurological mechanism is the same. And the negativity bias means that one critical email will have more psychological impact than 10 complementary ones. Not because you are weak or pessimistic, because your brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The second major survival mechanism is the default mode network, which is the brain network that becomes active when you are not focused on an external task. Most people think of mind wandering as a failure of attention. What the research shows is that mind wandering is not a bug. It is the brain's default operating mode when it is not under external demand. And what does the brain do in default mode? It simulates the future, primarily looking for threats. It replays the past, primarily looking for what went wrong and what could be learned from it. And it generates social simulations, imagining what other people think of you and whether those social assessments represent threats to your standing. This is why your mind, when left without external focus, tends to drift toward rumination, social anxiety, and worst-case scenario planning rather than toward spontaneous contentment. The brain in default mode is doing threat surveillance. And from a survival standpoint, threat surveillance is exactly the right thing to do when you are not actively engaged with the immediate environment. The cost is that in modern environments, where actual threat density is relatively low, this continuous threat surveillance produces a background of psychological noise, a low-grade chronic anxiety that does not reflect the actual danger level, but reflects the brain faithfully doing its job in a world it was not designed for. The third mechanism is hedonic adaptation. The brain returns to a relatively stable baseline level of well-being after positive or negative life events. The classic research by Brickman, Coates, and Jenoff-Bowman, comparing the long-term well-being of lottery winners and accident victims, found that both groups returned to near baseline well-being within a relatively short period after their respective life-changing events. The lottery winners were not substantially happier 1 year later. The accident victims were not substantially less happy. The brain adjusts its reference point. New positive circumstances are taken for granted. New negative circumstances become the new normal. The functional purpose is clear. An organism that could be fully satisfied with a specific set of conditions would stop striving to improve those conditions. The brain that is never fully satisfied keeps pushing. For survival, that is adaptive. For subjective well-being, it means that the things you believe will make you happy almost never make you as happy as you expect, or for as long as you expect, because the brain adapts. The fourth mechanism is loss aversion, documented extensively by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in their development of prospect theory. Losses are psychologically approximately twice as painful as equivalent gains are pleasurable. Losing $100 feels roughly twice as bad as gaining $100 feels good. The evolutionary logic is the same as the negativity bias. An organism in a resource-limited environment where losses can be catastrophic should be more motivated to avoid losses than to pursue equivalent gains. This calibration is adaptive in scarcity conditions and produces significant irrationality in modern life. Loss aversion explains why people hold losing investments too long, because selling would make the loss real. Why people stay in bad relationships and bad jobs, because leaving feels like a loss even when staying is causing harm. Why people are more motivated by the threat of losing something they have than by the prospect of gaining something equally valuable. They do not. The fifth mechanism is social threat detection. Human beings are intensely social animals, and for most of our evolutionary history, social exclusion was not merely unpleasant. It was genuinely life-threatening. Being excluded from the group meant losing access to protection, food sharing, cooperative childcare, all the benefits that made survival possible. The brain evolved, accordingly, to treat social threats with the same urgency as physical threats. Research by Naomi Eisenberger and Matthew Lieberman at UCLA using functional MRI has shown that social exclusion activates the same brain regions, including the anterior cingulate cortex and the insular cortex, that are activated by physical pain. The experience of social rejection is not metaphorically painful. It is neurologically processed through the same pathways as physical pain. This is why what other people think of you feels so important, even when you consciously know their opinion will not determine your survival. The system monitoring social standing is not listening to your conscious reasoning. It is monitoring for threats to group membership with the same vigilance the threat detection system uses for physical danger. Now I want to go into what I think is the most practically important thing I found in all of this research: the relationship between the survival brain and the learning brain, and what that relationship means for how you actually change behavior and build new capacities. Learning at the level of the brain is not primarily about information storage. It is about changing the probability of future behavior by updating the neural circuits that generate behavior. And the brain's primary mechanism for doing that is not reasoning. It is prediction error. The brain continuously makes predictions about what will happen next based on prior experience. When what actually happens matches the prediction, no learning signal is generated. When what happens violates the prediction, a learning signal is generated that is proportional to the magnitude of the violation. This prediction error signal is carried primarily by dopamine neurons, and it drives all learning in the brain from simple conditioning to complex skill acquisition. The practical implication is significant. You do not learn primarily from what you intend. You learn primarily from what surprises you. The brain updates its models of the world in response to prediction errors, regardless of whether you were trying to learn or not. This is why you can teach yourself a bad habit just as efficiently as a good one. The brain is not trying to make you better. It is trying to make accurate predictions. And if bad behavior is what produces the prediction errors that update the neural circuits, the brain will build more reliable circuitry for that bad behavior. The second aspect of the learning system that matters practically is the role of context specificity. Neural circuits are strengthened through repetition in specific contexts. The brain is extraordinarily context sensitive. Behaviors practiced in one context are not automatically available in different contexts. This is why people can behave with extraordinary emotional intelligence in professional settings and then completely lose that intelligence in intimate relationships. They have practiced emotional regulation in one context sufficiently to build efficient neural circuits for there, but those circuits do not automatically activate in a different context where the stakes are higher and the triggers are more deeply wired. You cannot rely on building a skill in one context and expecting it to transfer automatically to all others. You need to practice the specific behavior in the specific context where you need it, because the brain builds context-specific circuits, not context-general ones. The third aspect of how the brain actually learns is state-dependent learning. What you learn is stored in a way that is connected to the physiological and emotional state you were in when you learned it. Information acquired in a calm state is more easily retrieved in calm states. Behaviors practiced under stress are more reliably available under stress. Military and first responder training is conducted under genuine stress conditions precisely because of this. The skills need to be available under high stress conditions and must be practiced in those conditions, because what you practice in one state is not automatically available in a different state. Decision-making is the next area I want to address, because the popular understanding of how decisions are made is almost entirely wrong in ways that lead to consistently failed strategies. The rational actor model holds that decisions are made by evaluating options, assessing costs and benefits, and choosing the best expected value. This model is empirically false. Research from behavioral economics and from Antonio Damasio's work on the somatic marker hypothesis tells a very different story. Decisions are made primarily by emotional systems that generate a rapid intuitive judgment, and then the rational mind either endorses that judgment or engages in effortful deliberation that may or may not override it. Most decisions happen before conscious deliberation begins, and the deliberation that follows is often post hoc rationalization rather than genuine analysis. Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis proposes that the emotional bodily signal accompanying the thought of an option, what he calls the somatic marker, is what guides decisions in complex, uncertain situations. When you think about doing something and feel a sense of rightness or wrongness in your body, that is not noise to be ignored in favor of rational analysis. That is the brain's rapid integration of enormous amounts of prior experience communicating through an emotional bodily channel. There is another dimension of decision-making that comes directly from the survival architecture, the influence of threat state on decision quality. When the brain's threat detection system is activated, blood flow to the prefrontal cortex decreases, blood flow to the amygdala increases, the time horizon of attention narrows to the immediate, and the brain shifts from flexible exploratory thinking to rigid routine-based responding. This is adaptive in genuine emergencies where fast familiar responses keep you alive. In modern contexts where most apparent threats are not life-threatening, it means that the situations where you most need your best thinking are exactly the situations where the threat response is most actively impairing that thinking. The hostile email that makes you feel attacked is precisely the situation where you most need nuanced, thoughtful response, and precisely where the threat response is pushing you toward reactive defensive response. Understanding this does not make the threat response disappear, but it gives you the meta-awareness to recognize when you are in a threat state and to deliberately delay response until the prefrontal cortex is more available, which requires physiological downregulation, not just telling yourself to calm down. The attention system is the final major area I want to cover because it is the most directly relevant to performance and to the quality of daily experience in modern life. The brain's attention system evolved to solve a specific problem. In an information-rich environment, you cannot process everything. The selection criteria the brain uses are not the ones that serve your conscious goals. The brain allocates attention primarily based on novelty, threat, and social relevance. Anything new, anything that might be dangerous, and anything related to other people and their assessment of you gets automatic attentional priority. Everything else has to compete for remaining capacity through top-down, effortful direction. This is why the modern smartphone is so extraordinarily compelling. It delivers novelty, social information, and implicit social threat, the fear of missing out, the fear of negative social evaluation, at a rate and intensity that vastly exceeds anything the natural environment ever produced. You are not weak for being distracted by your phone. You are being outcompeted by a system that has been engineered to exploit your brain's oldest and most powerful attentional mechanisms. Understanding this changes the strategy from willpower to environment design. Removing the stimuli that capture attention through the survival systems is orders of magnitude more effective than trying to override those captures through effortful self-control. The practical framework I want to leave you with draws on everything I have described. The first principle is to work with the survival brain rather than against it. The brain's survival mechanisms are not your enemy. Fighting them directly is almost always less effective than redirecting them. Redesign your environment so that the survival brain's automatic responses serve your goals rather than undermining them. Make the healthy food easier to access than the unhealthy food. Make the phone harder to reach during focus time. Make the beginning of exercise automatic rather than a daily decision point. Reduce the cognitive load by changing what the brain encounters automatically rather than asking the prefrontal cortex to override the older systems through repeated effortful control. The second principle is to use the learning system's actual mechanisms. The brain learns through prediction, error, repetition, and state-dependent practice. Practice new behaviors in the specific contexts and emotional states where you need them. Allow yourself to be genuinely surprised by positive outcomes rather than filtering them out. And create learning conditions that match the conditions of application. If you need emotional regulation under stress, practice it under progressively increasing stress, not only in optimal calm conditions. The third principle is to deliberately and consistently amplify positive signal to correct for the negativity bias, not as denial, but as a compensatory practice that corrects a known systematic bias. Research on gratitude practices shows they improve well-being not by creating a falsely positive view of reality, but by correcting the attentional asymmetry the negativity bias produces. You are forcing your attention to spend time on the positive information that the bias would otherwise skip past because the brain already processes negative information automatically and needs deliberate help processing positive information with comparable salience. The fourth principle is to understand loss aversion and use it rather than be used by it. If losses are more motivating than equivalent gains, structure your goals around what you have to lose rather than what you have to gain. Commitment devices that put something concrete at stake are more motivating than vague aspirational goals. The research on pre-commitment strategies consistently shows that people who have something real at risk if they fail to follow through are substantially more likely to follow through than those relying on positive aspiration alone. The fifth principle is the most important and most underused: the deliberate cultivation of physiological states that support the capacities you want. The prefrontal cortex, the threat response, the attention system, none of these operate at fixed levels. Sleep quality directly determines prefrontal cortex availability the following day. Exercise within the previous 24 hours significantly improves emotional regulation capacity and cognitive flexibility. Chronic stress depletes the prefrontal resources that self-regulation requires. Social connection activates the parasympathetic nervous system and reduces baseline threat detection activity. Cold exposure produces rapid parasympathetic rebound that substantially reduces threat response baseline for hours afterward. These are not metaphors. These are specific, measurable, replicable physiological interventions that change how your brain works at the biological level. And they are consistently more effective than purely cognitive strategies because they operate directly on the substrate rather than on the outputs of that substrate. Now I want to go considerably deeper on the stress response, because most people understand intellectually that stress is bad, but very few understand mechanically what chronic stress actually does to the brain structures that determine their capacity for the exact thinking and behavior change they are trying to develop. The stress response, mediated primarily by cortisol and the HPA axis, is designed to be short and intense. A threat appears, cortisol surges, resources are mobilized, the threat is dealt with, cortisol drops, the system recovers. In that pattern, cortisol is not harmful, it is essential. The problem is chronic activation of a system designed for acute activation. When cortisol is chronically elevated, the consequences for the brain are specific and serious. The hippocampus, which is most critical for forming new memories and for contextualizing emotional responses so the amygdala does not overfire in safe situations, is directly damaged by chronic cortisol exposure. Cortisol suppresses neurogenesis in the hippocampus and can actually reduce hippocampal volume with prolonged exposure. A less effective hippocampus means a less well-regulated amygdala, which means higher baseline anxiety, greater threat sensitivity, and reduced capacity to distinguish genuinely threatening situations from merely uncomfortable ones. Chronic stress literally makes you worse at managing stress by impairing the brain structure, most important for stress management. And the prefrontal cortex is the second structure most damaged through a different mechanism. Chronic cortisol reduces the density of dendritic spines on prefrontal neurons, meaning the connections between neurons in the prefrontal cortex become less numerous and less efficient. This directly reduces the prefrontal cortex's capacity for impulse control, emotional regulation, complex planning, perspective taking, and the ability to weigh long-term consequences against short-term impulses. The people who most need those functions are usually the people under the most chronic stress. The intervention points directly toward the physiological. Sleep is the single most powerful tool for cortisol regulation. Exercise chronically increases the brain's capacity to manage the cortisol response. And social connection suppresses HPA axis activity directly. The memory system deserves deeper treatment because it explains why insight alone, even accurate and deeply felt insight, so rarely produces lasting behavioral change. Memory in the brain is not a single system. Declarative memory for facts and events you can consciously recall is mediated primarily by the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. Procedural memory for skills and habits is mediated primarily by the basal ganglia and cerebellum, and emotional memory for the emotional significance of past events is mediated primarily by the amygdala. These three memory systems operate in parallel and can produce contradictory outputs simultaneously. You can consciously know that a situation is safe, your declarative memory says so, while simultaneously feeling fear, your amygdala says this situation resembles a past threat, and simultaneously executing a habitual avoidance behavior, your basal ganglia executing the behavior that was reinforced by past avoidance. Three different memory systems, three different outputs simultaneously. The emotional and procedural systems are older, faster, and often more behaviorally influential than the declarative one. This is why someone can spend years in therapy developing accurate intellectual understanding of their patterns and still find those patterns activated in real situations. The declarative memory has been updated, the amygdala-based emotional memory has not, and the procedural memory in the basal ganglia has not. Insight is necessary, but not sufficient. The other memory systems need updating through different mechanisms. Emotional memory through new emotional experiences in old contexts that rewrites the amygdala's threat associations, and procedural memory through repetitive practice in specific contexts that overwrites habitual behavioral sequences. Neuroplasticity is simultaneously the most hopeful and most misunderstood area of modern neuroscience. The adult brain undergoes continuous structural change in response to experience, learning, and practice. New synaptic connections form, existing connections strengthen or weaken, new neurons are generated in the hippocampus throughout the adult lifespan. This is the scientific basis for the possibility of genuine lasting change at any age. But neuroplasticity is not magic. The brain changes slowly, in specific ways, in response to specific types of experience, and the changes require repetition, sleep, and the right physiological conditions to consolidate. The most exciting finding about neuroplasticity that I encountered is the role of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, in facilitating neural change. BDNF supports the survival and growth of neurons and the formation of new synaptic connections. And the most powerful known stimulus for BDNF release is aerobic exercise. A single bout of moderate intensity aerobic exercise produces a significant acute increase in BDNF levels in the brain, and regular aerobic exercise produces sustained elevation of baseline BDNF. This means that exercise does not just benefit the body, it directly enhances the brain's capacity for the neural change that underlies all learning and behavioral change. The person who exercises before cognitively demanding work or before practicing new psychological skills is specifically improving the biological conditions that allow the brain to change in response to their practice. Exercise is not separate from mental and behavioral development. It is one of the primary mechanisms through which that development is supported at the neurological level. Sleep's role in neuroplasticity requires equally specific treatment. During sleep, the brain undergoes synaptic homeostasis in which the connections strengthened during the day's learning are consolidated into lasting structural change. Research on sleep deprivation and learning has shown that even one night of poor sleep reduces the consolidation of the previous day's learning by a significant and measurable amount. The practice sessions, the deliberate effort to build new capacities, they need to be followed by adequate sleep for the neural changes produced by that practice to consolidate into lasting structural change. Practicing skills and then sleeping poorly is like filling a container with a hole in the bottom. You are putting effort in, but not getting the lasting change because the consolidation process that would make the effort stick is not completing. The social brain deserves specific treatment because the survival importance of social connection is one of the most underappreciated dimensions of human neuroscience. The evidence is unambiguous. Human beings are obligately social animals in the sense that the nervous system does not function well in prolonged social isolation. Research by John Cacioppo on the neuroscience of loneliness documented that chronic loneliness produces a specific profile of neurobiological changes that are genuinely health-threatening. elevated cortisol and inflammatory cytokines, disrupted sleep architecture, reduced prefrontal cortex function, and elevated amygdala reactivity to social threat cues. Loneliness is not just emotionally painful. It is biologically dangerous in measurable ways. The brain treats the social isolation signal with the same urgency as a physical threat, because for most of human history, it was one. Maintaining meaningful social connection is not optional for optimal brain function. It is a biological requirement. This is one of the reasons that the same person can seem like a completely different person in different social contexts. The well-connected, socially secure person and the lonely, socially anxious person are operating from fundamentally different neurobiological baselines. The act of naming an emotional state, what neuroscientists call affect labeling, has been shown in neuroimaging research by Matthew Lieberman to reduce amygdala activation in response to emotional stimuli. When subjects were shown emotionally activating images and asked to name the emotion they felt, their amygdala response was measurably reduced compared to when they viewed the images without labeling their emotional response. Simply finding words for what you are feeling reduces the biological intensity of the emotional response. This is not a metaphorical effect, it is a measured neurological one. The more precisely you can name what you are feeling, the more effectively the prefrontal cortex can modulate the amygdala response. Emotional granularity, the capacity to distinguish between closely related emotional states with precision, is a direct functional tool for emotional regulation. Psychological safety and its relationship to the learning and performance brain has implications for everything from how children develop, to how workplaces function, to how individuals approach their own growth. Research by Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School documented that psychological safety is the primary predictor of team performance and learning capacity. Teams that feel psychologically safe take more risks, report errors more rapidly, propose more innovative ideas, and learn more effectively. The neurological explanation is exactly what the survival brain architecture predicts. When the threat detection system is activated by a socially threatening environment, the prefrontal cortex is suppressed, creative and exploratory thinking is reduced, and behavior becomes defensive. When the environment has been assessed as safe, the prefrontal cortex is more fully available, associative thinking is enhanced, and the person is neurologically capable of the learning and risk-taking that development requires. Environments that are critical, shaming, or punishing of error literally impair the cognitive performance and learning capacity of the people within them, not through motivation or morale, but through the direct neurological effect of social threat on prefrontal function. The brain's prediction system shapes subjective experience in ways that are far more profound than most people realize. The brain is not a passive receiver of sensory information. It is an active predictor that generates an expectation of what it will perceive before the sensory information arrives, then compares actual input to the prediction and processes primarily the difference. What you perceive is not what is actually out there. It is your brain's best prediction corrected by the mismatch between that prediction and actual sensory input. Your emotional experience of an event is not primarily determined by what actually happened. It is primarily determined by the difference between what you predicted would happen and what actually happened. A mediocre outcome that was expected produces less negative emotion than the same mediocre outcome that was surprising. An excellent outcome that was expected produces less positive emotion than the same excellent outcome that was surprising. Expectations literally shape the emotional quality of experience through the specific neuroscience of prediction, error generation, and processing. The relationship between physical movement and emotional state is bidirectional in a way that the popular understanding misses. Your body position and movement patterns send signals upward to the brain that influence emotional state through afferent feedback. Walking, specifically rhythmic, moderate-paced walking, reduces amygdala activity and improves mood through mechanisms that include regulation of autonomic nervous system activity and the simple act of moving through space, which was the normal accompaniment to active engaged states. Evolved environment. The act of moving your body is not separate from the act of regulating your mental state. They are the same system operating in both directions simultaneously. The most honest and most practically important thing I can say after years of engaging with this material is this. The gap between knowing what you should do and actually doing it is not primarily an information gap. It is a biological gap. The brain is not a rational organ that cooperates with your conscious plans. It is a survival organ that has extraordinarily powerful mechanisms for directing behavior toward what it interprets as survival relevant, and those mechanisms operate faster than consciousness, below the level of deliberate control, and with more force than willpower can reliably override. This is not discouraging. It is clarifying, because once you have an accurate map of the terrain, you can navigate it. You stop wasting energy trying to beat the brain at its own game and start working with the brain's actual mechanics. You design your environment, your practices, and your physiology to put the brain's automatic systems in service of what you actually want. You use loss aversion and the negativity bias rather than being defeated by them. You build habits in the specific context where you need them. And you maintain the physiological conditions that give the prefrontal cortex the best possible chance of being online when you actually need it. Your brain is not designed to make you happy, but once you understand what it is actually designed to do, you have a genuine fighting chance of using it to build something that includes happiness as a byproduct of a life that the brain, correctly understood and correctly managed, can actually support. Thank you for your time. I want to go deeper on several areas that deserve more complete treatment because the full picture is significantly richer and more actionable than what I covered above. Let me start with something that I think is the single most important practical insight that emerges from understanding the survival design of the brain, and that most people never fully appreciate because they are thinking about behavior change at the wrong level. Most approaches to self-improvement operate at the level of motivation and intention. You decide you want to change, you commit to changing, you try to maintain the commitment through willpower and discipline, and then the commitment erodes and the behavior reverts, and you conclude that you lack the willpower or the character or the discipline to sustain the change. This story is told millions of times every year in gyms and journals and therapy offices, and it is almost always wrong in the same specific way. The behavior did not revert because you lacked willpower. It reverted because the environment that generated the original behavior was still in place. The brain is extraordinarily sensitive to environmental cues. The sight of certain foods triggers eating behavior. The sight of the phone triggers reaching behavior. The arrival home from work triggers the alcohol reaching behavior. These are not decisions. They are conditioned responses that the environment is triggering automatically through exactly the same mechanisms that Pavlov documented in his dogs. The cue is in the environment. The response is in the brain. And no amount of motivational commitment changes the cue-response connection if the cue is still present in the environment and the connection has been sufficiently reinforced through repetition. The behavior change strategy that actually works is not trying harder to resist the cue. It is changing the environment so the cue is no longer present, or so the cue now triggers a different conditioned response, or so a new cue triggers the desired behavior. This is what behavioral scientists call environmental design, and it is consistently more effective than motivational approaches for exactly the reason the brain architecture predicts. It does not require the prefrontal cortex to override the older systems through effortful self-control. It redirects the older systems rather than trying to suppress them. James Clear's research and synthesis on habit formation and the underlying behavioral science from B.J. Fogg and others converges on the same insight. The most powerful lever for behavior change is not motivation. It is friction. Reducing the friction between you and the behavior you want and increasing the friction between you and the behavior you do not want is more effective per unit of effort than any motivational intervention. Put your gym clothes out the night before. Put the fruit on the counter and the junk food in a cabinet, or preferably not in the house at all. Put the phone in another room. Make the default behavior the one you want rather than the one you are trying to change. The brain follows the path of least resistance, and you can redesign what that path looks like. I want to go deeper on the dopamine system and its relationship to behavior change, because I think the popular understanding of dopamine that has entered culture in recent years is both partially accurate and importantly incomplete in ways that lead to wrong conclusions. Dopamine is widely described as the pleasure molecule, and that description is wrong in a specific and consequential way. Dopamine is not the molecule of pleasure. It is the molecule of anticipated reward, of motivation, of the drive to pursue. The research by Wolfram Schultz on dopamine neuron firing patterns established that dopamine neurons respond not to reward itself, but to the prediction of reward, and specifically to the violation of that prediction in the positive direction. When something good happens that was not expected, dopamine fires strongly. When something good happens that was expected, dopamine response is minimal because the prediction was accurate and there is nothing new to learn. And when an expected reward fails to arrive, dopamine drops below baseline, producing the subjective experience of disappointment and reduced motivation. This is the actual biology underlying why pursuing goals produces more sustained motivation than achieving them. The pursuit involves continuous prediction error. The achievement closes the prediction error. And the brain, calibrated to update in response to prediction errors, has less to do after the goal is achieved than during the pursuit of it. This is not a flaw. It is the design. The brain that is satisfied with achievement and stops pursuing is an evolutionary dead end. But it explains why peak achievers so often describe feeling deflated after reaching major goals, and why the next goal needs to already be forming before the current one is achieved if motivation is going to remain high. The specific practical implication for sustained motivation is that the design of goal pursuit matters as much as the goal itself. Goals that generate continuous feedback, that have intermediate milestones, that produce genuine positive prediction errors, and that involve genuine uncertainty about each step of the process, sustain dopamine-driven motivation far better than goals that are distant, vague, and monolithic. The research on implementation intentions, the specific practice of planning exactly when, where, and how you will execute a behavior, improves follow-through precisely because it increases the specificity of the prediction and therefore increases the salience of the prediction error when the behavior either occurs or fails to occur. The brain has more to learn from a specific prediction than from a vague aspiration. The relationship between attention and the survival brain is something I want to develop more specifically because attention is the primary resource through which you influence your neural development. You become what you repeatedly attend to, not metaphorically. The circuits that represent what you attend to are the circuits that are activated repeatedly, and the circuits that are repeatedly activated are the ones that strengthen through synaptic potentiation. Your attentional choices are therefore your most direct influence over your own neural development. When you spend hours a day attending to social media content designed to activate your novelty detection, social threat monitoring, and emotional reactivity systems, those are the circuits you are strengthening. When you spend hours a day attending to deep work that requires sustained focus, creative problem solving, and complex reasoning, those are the circuits you are strengthening. When you spend time in genuine presence with other people, reading their emotional states accurately and responding with empathy, those are the circuits you are strengthening. The brain does not distinguish between practicing these things for the purpose of development and practicing them simply because that is what your attention is doing. It just strengthens the circuits that are being used, which makes the question of what you consistently attend to one of the most important questions about who you are becoming over time, independent of any explicit self-improvement intention. The relationship between sleep and virtually every aspect of brain function that I have described deserves one more specific treatment because I think people understand sleep as important in the general sense without fully understanding why it is important in the specific sense that changes their behavior around it. Sleep is not passive. During sleep, the brain is extraordinarily active in ways that are specific and essential. During slow-wave sleep, the glymphatic system, the brain's waste clearance system that requires sleep to operate effectively, clears the metabolic byproducts of the day's neural activity, including amyloid beta proteins that, when they accumulate, are associated with neurodegenerative disease. During REM sleep, emotional memories are processed and their emotional charge is reduced through a mechanism that involves replaying the memory in a neurochemical environment that is absent of norepinephrine, which appears to allow the memory to be consolidated without the emotional intensity of the original experience. This is the mechanism by which sleep helps with emotional processing of difficult experiences. It is also the mechanism that is disrupted by chronic sleep deprivation, which is one of the reasons chronically sleep-deprived people have a harder time emotionally processing difficult experiences and tend to have more intense and persistent emotional reactions to negative events. During both slow wave and REM sleep, the synaptic consolidation process I described earlier is occurring, converting the day's learning from temporary activation to lasting structural change. And during sleep, growth hormone is secreted in its highest daily pulse, supporting cellular repair throughout the body, including the brain. Sleep is not downtime. It is the period during which the brain does the processing, repair, and consolidation work that makes the day's experiences into lasting development. Treating sleep as negotiable, as time that can be borrowed from without cost, is treating the most productive hours of your neural development as expendable. The connection between the gut and the brain is an area that has emerged in the neuroscience literature over the past 15 years and that I want to address because it challenges the intuitive picture of the brain as a top-down controller and reveals it as a bidirectional system that is profoundly influenced by what is happening in the body. The enteric nervous system, sometimes called the second brain, is a network of approximately 100 million neurons embedded in the lining of the gastrointestinal tract. This neural network operates largely autonomously and sends more signals upward to the brain through the vagus nerve than it receives signals downward from the brain. The gut microbiome, the community of trillions of microorganisms living in the gastrointestinal tract, influences the enteric nervous system, and through it influences the brain in ways that are only beginning to be understood. Specific gut bacteria produce neurotransmitter precursors, including tryptophan, which is the precursor to serotonin. Approximately 90% of the body's serotonin is produced in the gut. The gut-brain axis influences mood, anxiety, stress response, and cognitive function through mechanisms that include vagal nerve signaling, the production of neurotransmitter precursors, the modulation of inflammatory cytokines, and the production of short-chain fatty acids that influence brain function. Research has shown that interventions that alter the gut microbiome composition, including dietary changes and probiotic supplementation, can measurably alter mood, anxiety, and stress response in ways that suggest the gut-brain connection is not merely incidental. For practical purposes, the main implication is that dietary patterns that support a diverse, healthy gut microbiome, primarily diets high in fiber from whole plant foods and fermented foods that provide beneficial bacteria, support brain function through the gut-brain axis in ways that extend well beyond the nutritional value of the food itself. The concept of allostatic load is one I want to introduce because it provides a useful framework for understanding how cumulative stress affects the brain and body in ways that the moment-to-moment stress response model does not fully capture. Allostasis is the process by which the body maintains stability through change, constantly adjusting physiological parameters in response to demands. Allostatic load is the cumulative cost of this continuous adjustment, the wear and tear that accumulates when the body and brain are repeatedly or chronically required to manage demands that exceed their recovery capacity. High allostatic load is associated with accelerated biological aging, measured by markers including telomere length, epigenetic clocks, and inflammatory biomarkers. It is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, cognitive decline, and depression. And it is associated with the specific brain changes I described earlier: reduced hippocampal volume, reduced prefrontal density, and elevated amygdala reactivity. The allostatic load concept is useful practically because it shifts the frame from managing acute stress to managing the cumulative account of demands versus recovery over time. People who are highly functional under acute stress can still be accumulating allostatic load if they never allow adequate recovery between demands. The appropriate metaphor is not strength, the ability to withstand individual stress events, but fitness, the capacity for full recovery between efforts that allows you to handle each successive effort at full capacity. Chronic under-recovery is not strength. It is the progressive depletion of the biological resources that make strength possible. I want to address the brain's response to uncertainty specifically because it is one of the mechanisms I find most practically important and least discussed. The brain experiences uncertainty not as a neutral state of insufficient information, but as a specific form of threat. Neuroimaging research has shown that uncertainty activates the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula in ways that overlap with the threat response, and that uncertain negative outcomes produce more sustained amygdala activation than certain negative outcomes of equivalent or even greater magnitude. The certainty of a bad outcome is less distressing to the brain than the uncertainty of whether a bad outcome will occur. This is why waiting for a medical test result is often more distressing than receiving a negative result. The uncertainty is more threatening than the information, even if the information is bad. The practical implications of this are significant. It explains why people avoid making decisions that would generate negative feedback, because the uncertainty of how bad the feedback might be is more threatening than the certain experience of receiving it. It explains why people stay in bad situations they know rather than risking change to situations that might be better, because the certain badness of the current situation is less threatening than the uncertain outcome of change. And it explains why people seek reassurance compulsively, even when the reassurance does not change the underlying situation, because the temporary reduction in uncertainty is itself a reduction in threat that produces brief but real relief. Understanding the brain's specific response to uncertainty is important for developing strategies that allow you to act in the face of it rather than being controlled by the threat response that uncertainty reliably generates. Let me close with the most fundamental reframe I can offer about the relationship between understanding your brain and living well. The popular self-help narrative tends toward one of two poles. Either the brain is portrayed as an obstacle, the source of biases and irrationalities that you need to overcome through discipline and effort, or the brain is portrayed as a tool, a machine that you can optimize and hack into performing better. Both of these framings miss something important. Your brain is not your obstacle, and it is not your tool. It is you. It is the biological substrate through which every experience of your life is processed. Every thought you have, every feeling, every decision, every connection. The fact that it is biased towards survival rather than toward happiness is not a defect. It is the consequence of an extraordinary evolutionary engineering project that has been running for hundreds of millions of years. The parts of the brain that generate anxiety and negativity bias and social threat monitoring are the same parts that allowed your ancestors to survive long enough to produce you. They are not bugs in an otherwise perfect system. They are features of a system built for a different environment that are still running their original programming in your modern life. The work is not to eliminate those programs. It is to understand them well enough to work with them intelligently, to use the learning system's actual mechanisms for building new patterns, to use the environment to redirect the automatic systems rather than relying on willpower to override them, to maintain the physiological conditions that give the prefrontal cortex the maximum possible availability when you need it. And to recognize that the moments when you feel most like your brain is working against you are usually the moments when it is working hardest to protect you, using the only tools it evolved to use, even when those tools are not the right ones for the situation at hand. That recognition, the shift from frustration at your brain's interference to curiosity about what it is trying to protect you from, is one of the most productive shifts in perspective I found in all of these conversations. And it is available to anyone willing to look at the actual map rather than the one they wish they had. Thank you for your time. There are several more areas I want to develop fully because they are too important to leave abbreviated. One of the things I found most striking in conversations with brain researchers was the discussion of what is called the default toward negative interpretation, which is distinct from the negativity bias I described earlier and works through a different mechanism. The negativity bias is about attention and memory weighting. The default toward negative interpretation is about how ambiguous information is processed. When the brain receives information that is genuinely ambiguous, meaning it could plausibly be interpreted as threatening or as benign, it tends systematically to resolve that ambiguity toward the threatening interpretation. This is sometimes called the hostile attribution bias when it applies specifically to social situations. When someone does not respond to your message, that is ambiguous. They might be busy. They might be upset with you. They might not have seen it. The survival brain tends to resolve that ambiguity toward the threatening interpretation. They are upset with you. When a colleague does not make eye contact in the hallway, That is ambiguous. They might be distracted. They might be avoiding you. The survival brain tends toward the threatening resolution. When a friend cancels plans, that is ambiguous. They might genuinely be ill or overwhelmed. They might be pulling away. The survival brain goes to the threatening interpretation first. This default matters enormously for the quality of social life and for anxiety levels. Because most social information is genuinely ambiguous, and the survival brain's systematic tendency to resolve ambiguity toward threat generates a continuous supply of social anxiety that is largely disconnected from actual social reality. The practice of deliberately and explicitly generating alternative benign interpretations of ambiguous social information is not naive optimism. It is a corrective practice that counteracts a known systematic bias in the same way that correcting for the negativity bias is a corrective practice rather than a form of denial. The connection between the survival brain and what psychologists call the ego, meaning the sense of self and its defense, is something I want to address because I think it explains an enormous amount of otherwise puzzling human behavior. The ego or self concept is, from a neuroscience perspective, a predictive model, a representation of who you are, what you are capable of, and what role you occupy in your social world that the brain uses to generate predictions about how to behave and what to expect from the world. And like every predictive model, the brain is strongly motivated to defend this one against information that would require it to be revised. Information that threatens the self-concept is processed through the same threat detection system as information that threatens physical safety for reasons that make evolutionary sense. In the social environment where the human brain evolved, damage to your reputation and social standing was a genuine threat to your survival. A threat to who you are, your reliability, your competence, your goodness in the eyes of others was a threat to your place in the group. And so the brain defends the self-concept with the same urgency it defends physical safety. This is why criticism is so activating, why failure is experienced as threat rather than as information, why people are so resistant to evidence that challenges their existing beliefs, why it is so hard to change your mind in public, and why the experience of being wrong about something important can feel genuinely destabilizing rather than merely informative. Understanding that the brain defends the self-concept as a survival function does not make it easier to tolerate being wrong. But it does change the frame from moral failure, I should be more open-minded, to biological mechanism. My threat detection system is firing because it perceives a challenge to the predictive model it has built of who I am. And that reframe opens the possibility of engaging with the defensive response with curiosity rather than shame, which is the only internal posture that actually allows the self-concept to update without feeling catastrophic. The executive function systems of the prefrontal cortex deserve a more detailed treatment than I have given them because they are the specific neural mechanisms through which you can influence the survival systems rather than being entirely controlled by them. Executive function is a broad term for a set of cognitive capacities that are concentrated in the prefrontal cortex, and that include working memory, the capacity to hold information in mind and manipulate it, cognitive flexibility, the capacity to shift between different perspectives, rules, or mental frameworks, inhibitory control, the capacity to suppress a prepotent response in favor of a more adaptive one, and planning, the capacity to represent future states and organize present behavior toward them. These are the capacities that distinguish deliberate, adaptive human behavior from reactive, automatic behavior. And they are the capacities that are most sensitive to the conditions I have been discussing throughout this episode. Sleep deprivation degrades them specifically and severely. Chronic stress degrades them. High cognitive load depletes them. Social threat reduces access to them. Physical inactivity reduces them over time through reduced BDNF and reduced cerebrovascular health. And emotional dysregulation, specifically the activation of the amygdala and the threat response, reduces prefrontal executive function in real time through the inhibitory connections between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. When the amygdala fires strongly, it literally sends inhibitory signals to the prefrontal cortex that reduce its activity. The parts of the brain that evolved to protect you from immediate threat do so partly by reducing the influence of the parts of the brain that would deliberate when you most need to act fast. The problem in modern life is that most of the situations that activate the amygdala are not ones that require fast physical action. They require exactly the kind of nuanced, delayed, complex thinking that the amygdala's inhibition of the prefrontal cortex is suppressing. The path forward requires both short-term practices for bringing the amygdala activity down in specific situations through breathing, through physical movement, through the affect labeling I described, and long-term practices for maintaining the prefrontal cortex in optimal operating condition through sleep, exercise, stress management, and the deliberate reduction of chronic cognitive load. Let me address the concept of cognitive flexibility more specifically, because I think it is the executive function most directly relevant to the capacity for genuine behavior change and learning. Cognitive flexibility is the capacity to view the same situation from multiple perspectives, to shift between different cognitive frameworks to generate alternative interpretations and alternative strategies when the current approach is not working. It is the opposite of cognitive rigidity, which is the tendency to apply the same cognitive framework repeatedly, even when it is not producing useful results. Cognitive rigidity increases with threat activation, with chronic stress, with sleep deprivation, and with high cognitive load. All of the conditions that compromise prefrontal function compromise cognitive flexibility specifically, because cognitive flexibility requires exactly the kind of active, effortful maintenance of multiple representations simultaneously that the prefrontal cortex provides. The practical consequence is that the situations in which you most need creative problem solving and alternative thinking, the genuinely difficult and novel challenges, are also the situations in which the conditions that impair cognitive flexibility, stress, uncertainty, cognitive load, are most likely to be present. Maintaining the conditions that support cognitive flexibility, primarily through sleep, exercise, and the deliberate management of chronic stress, is not just good for general health, it is specifically protective of the cognitive capacity that allows you to find new solutions to old problems rather than applying old solutions to new problems and being confused when they do not work. I want to address the neuroscience of habit formation in more specific detail than I gave it earlier, because I think the research here is specific enough to be directly actionable. A habit is a behavioral sequence that has been sufficiently reinforced through repetition that it can be executed by the basal ganglia with minimal prefrontal involvement. The formation of habits involves a process that neuroscientist Anne Grable's research at MIT identified as chunking. The brain packages an entire behavioral sequence into a single neural unit that can be triggered by a cue and executed as a block without requiring moment-to-moment conscious direction. This chunking is what makes habits efficient and reliable. It is also what makes them difficult to change, because the chunked representation in the basal ganglia does not disappear when you stop performing the behavior. It remains weakened but available and can be reactivated by the original cue. This is the neurological basis of the observation that addiction is never fully extinguished. The neural representation of the addictive behavior sequence remains in the basal ganglia even after years of abstinence, which is why exposure to the original cue can trigger powerful craving and behavioral activation even after extended absence of the behavior. It is also the basis of the practical wisdom that for changing unwanted habits, substitution is more effective than suppression. Because the cue response chain in the basal ganglia cannot simply be deleted, finding an alternative response to the same cue that gets reinforced through repetition can gradually overwrite the old response with a new one. The old representation weakens, the new one strengthens. The cue still triggers a response, but the response that is triggered changes through the competition between the two representations in the basal ganglia. The four elements of habit formation that emerge from this research are the cue, which triggers the behavioral sequence, the routine, which is the behavioral sequence itself, the reward, which reinforces the connection between the cue and the routine, and the craving, which is the anticipatory state generated by the cue that motivates execution of the routine. For building new habits, all four elements need to be designed. A reliable and consistent cue that will predictably trigger the routine, a routine that is achievable enough to be executed consistently in the beginning, starting small and building gradually, A reward that is immediate enough to reinforce the connection between the routine and the positive outcome, since the brain's reinforcement learning system is strongly biased toward immediate rewards over delayed ones. And the gradual development of craving, the anticipatory motivation that the cue generates through repeated pairing with reward, which is what eventually makes the habit feel like something you want to do rather than something you are making yourself do. I want to close with a reflection on what it means to live well with a brain that is designed for survival rather than for happiness, because I think this question has implications that go beyond the practical strategies I have described. The brain that evolution built is extraordinary. It is capable of language, art, science, mathematics, moral reasoning, and the construction of civilizations. It is capable of empathy, love, and the kind of meaning-making that allows human beings to find purpose in circumstances that are genuinely terrible. But it is also restless, anxious, easily threatened, prone to catastrophizing, and biased toward dissatisfaction in ways that are the direct consequence of the same evolutionary pressures that made it so capable. The challenge of being human is partly the challenge of living with this brain, using its extraordinary capacities while not being entirely controlled by its survival programs. The people who seem to do this best are not the ones who have eliminated the survival responses. They are the ones who have developed what I would call a more sophisticated relationship with those responses. They feel the anxiety, notice it as a survival signal, ask what it is responding to, decide whether that response is appropriate to the actual situation, and then choose whether to act from it or to act differently. They feel the pull toward rumination, notice it as threat surveillance, decide whether there is a genuine threat that requires attention, and if there is not, redirect their attention deliberately. They feel the defensiveness that comes when their self-concept is challenged, recognize it as the brain's protective response to a perceived threat to the predictive model, and create enough space between the feeling and the response to decide whether the challenge might be valuable, rather than just defending the model automatically. This is not the elimination of the survival brain. It is the development of a witnessing capacity that can observe the survival brain's outputs without being entirely controlled by them. And it is something that can be genuinely developed through the practices I have described throughout this episode. Mindfulness meditation builds the witnessing capacity. Journaling and self-reflection build the affect labeling capacity. Physical practices, including cold exposure and exercise, build the physiological resilience that reduces the baseline activity of the survival systems. And the environmental design practices build the conditions under which the prefrontal cortex has the maximum possible influence over the automatic survival responses. None of this produces a brain that has stopped being a survival organ. None of it eliminates anxiety or negativity bias or loss aversion, but it develops the relationship with those responses from one of unconscious control to one of conscious navigation. And that shift from being run by your survival brain to being able to work with it is probably the most significant development available to any human being willing to do the work of understanding what is actually running the show. Thank you for your time.